Welcome to day 12 of the 12 Days of Celtic Mythology, Season 3. I want to start by saying thanks to everybody who's followed this series. If you weren't part of the challenge, I hope you take some time to read the fabulous comments under each day's videos, maybe even contribute to the conversation and keep it going. So the responses to why do you study Celtic mythology? Some of them had me in fits of laughter, and others nearly moved me to tears. If you too suffer from amateur Celticism or even amateur Celticism, you'll find a lot to identify with there. Or maybe you can add your own story to the pile. I also want to draw your attention to what was one of the best comments of the series, I thought. I'll single it out because the person isn't even doing the challenge. So check out the analysis of Evnishin's actions by Lindsay River on day 8. It's absolutely stunning. And I'd also like to thank the people who've been turning up to the live sessions every day, or some days, even those who've just made it a few days. I'm not sure, honestly, that I'd bother to do this series every year if I was just telling these stories to a camera. By the end this year, we were really starting to feel like a wee community. And that's kind of the atmosphere I like to create with my online classes and recurring Patreon events. So if you want to be part of it, you don't need to wait for next year. A lot of people have been signing up for classes and joining Patreon this week. And I really appreciate that. It has felt a bit like the wolf might be at my door the past couple of months, and that will be a big help. But the biggest gift, really, that you guys can give me and yourself and others is to come to the live classes and events. Contribute your own ideas and questions to the wider community. When we left our story yesterday, the 7 surviving Britons were getting ready to leave Ireland with Bran's head and carry out his instructions. So let's join them. Bran's head was struck off. His 7 surviving friends left Ireland, and Branwen went with them. They landed in Anglesey, where they rested. Branwen gazed across to Ireland and then on the island of the mighty. I wish I'd never been born, she cried. 2 good islands have been destroyed because of me. And with that, the heart broke in her and she died. And they buried her in a 4-sided grave in Glenallow. The 7 continued to Harlech as Bran had told them to do, carrying the giant head with them. On the way, they met others on the road and asked them how things fared in Britain. Caswathan, son of Beli, has conquered all, they said, and is crowned king in London. But what of Craddock, son of Bran, they asked, and the other 6 riders who Bran left as caretakers? Caswathan killed all except Craddock, who died of terror and bewilderment when he saw a sword killing them and no one wielding it. Caswathan had put on a coat of invisibility. Alas, Caswathan would have spared him, being his kinsman, but he was one of the 3 people who broke their hearts from bewilderment in this island. They continued to Harlech, where they arranged themselves, and they were given a great feast. And as they ate and drank, 3 birds came and began to sing more sweetly and clearly than any bird song they had ever heard. They could see them far off over the sea, yet the singing sounded as if it was right beside them. And they were like that for 7 years. After that, they set out for Gwallis in Penfro, as Bran had said they would. They saw there a fair and royal place awaiting them above the sea. They made their way into a feasting hall, which had 2 open doors, but the 3rd door, which faced Cornwall, was closed. Behold the door we must not open, said Manawyddan. And again they began a wondrous feast, and they forgot the grief and suffering they had endured. No thought of any sorrow in the world came to them there. 80 joyful years they were at that feast, and Bran's head conversed with them just as he had done in life. Then one day, one of the 7 men, called Highland, son of Gwyn, said, Shame on me if I'm afraid to open that door. And so he opened it. And when he looked on Cornwall, the many losses and troubles they had endured just came flooding back to his mind and into the minds of his companions. After that, they were restless to set out again for London, and so that's what they did. They reached the White Hill that's now called Tower Hill, and there they buried Bran's head as he had asked them to do. That burial was one of the 3 fortunate concealments of the island of Britain. Later, it was one of the 3 unfortunate disclosures when it was dug up again by that fool Arthur. But no oppression could come over the sea to Britain while Bran's head was concealed thus. In Ireland, not a person was left alive except 5 pregnant women in a cave in the wilderness. In time, each bore a son, and when the sons were grown, they slept with the women, and so the people of Ireland were eventually replenished, and the island was divided into 5 provinces. And those people grew wealthy on the gold and silver they found in the battlefields of the past. Now ends this branch of the Mabinogi, which tells of the blow to Branwen and of the assembly of Bran's host to avenge her, and about the feast at Harlech and the singing of the birds of Rhiannon and of the feast of the severed head that lasted for 80 years. I hope you enjoyed this story as much as I enjoyed telling it for the very first time. So before I forget, here's the final question. There's a tradition that King Arthur dug up Bran's head because he thought he was supposed to be the ultimate protector of Britain himself, not Bran. So what's your response to that? Now then, you may recall that we started with a different King Bran. So I guess it's up to me to pull this together with a neat package for you. Normally at this point, there might be some talk of cauldrons, but I've talked about cauldrons an awful lot this year. They get quite a bit of attention in the Irish Brythonic Connections class and in the Other World Journeys class too. And there was a session on cauldrons on day 9 of last year's 12 Days of Celtic Mythology. And that will actually unravel a lot of mysteries for you. If you go back and look at that, I'll link it at the end. And there's a whole series on cauldrons that I made just recently. There's a playlist for that, and I'll link that too. Anyway, there's no cauldron in the Irish Bran stories. So what do those stories have in common with the second branch? Well, there are 3 obvious things. There's a king called Bran, a sea voyage or something like it, and either Maninan Maclear or Manawydn Vabslir. Is it just a coincidence? Well, scholars don't seem to think so. In fact, this weird semi-parallel between the stories has inspired many theories. The Irish scholar Pontius McCanna wrote a book about the second branch back in the 1950s, kind of building on the work of W.J. Griffith's work on the other branches. And maybe he's stating the obvious here, but let's remind ourselves. He writes, before discussing these associations, it may be as well to notice briefly the several ways in which correspondences between Welsh and Irish literature may be explained. They may derive from a common Celtic store of tradition. They may be a result of borrowings from Welsh or British tradition by the Irish. They may be due to the transmission of Irish tradition to Wales first of all, via the people of Irish origin in Dyfed and Gwynedd, the 2 cradles of the 4 branches. What a lovely phrase, the cradles of the 4 branches. It's important to keep in mind that some names, stories, and ideas found in both Ireland and Wales probably do go back to a very early Celtic-speaking culture from which both sets of people came. This is hard to either prove or disprove. Exactly how that worked is also unclear. We still don't really understand the sequence of timing of events in the development of Celtic languages, as Patrick Sims Williams reminds us here. Even today, there's no agreement as to how many millennia ago the Celtic languages diverged, or whether so-called Common Celtic was succeeded by an intermediate, mutually comprehensible dialect of Insular Celtic, which would be confined to Ireland and Britain, as opposed to the language of Gaul and Spain. So that's worth keeping in mind. You will hear a lot of theories about linguistic development, but the arguing hasn't stopped yet among the people who have the best chance of knowing the answer. The alternative is that the two islands are borrowing from each other. There's actually very little evidence that Irish mythological literature is influenced by Welsh. Based on the manuscript tradition, at least, the borrowing or influence was mostly in the opposite direction. For a really thorough look at that, I highly recommend Patrick Sims Williams' book that this quote comes from, Irish Influence on Medieval Welsh Literature. It's just possible that the Brigantes of Leinster were the same Brigantes as we find in northern England, and possibly even as the same Brigantes we find on the continent earlier. It's just possible that this influences the stories of the goddess Bride and Saint Bride. More generally, though, it was the Irish who settled in Britain, starting around the 6th century in Wales, although the stories are so garbled that it may have been quite a lot earlier that some of this settlement started. It's generally thought that the Irish settlements in northwest and southwest Wales had an influence on mythological stories like The Four Branches and Cilhwch and Olwen. As well as the historical evidence, the distribution of Irish alms stones in Wales tells a story, and of course in Cornwall and other places too. Welsh literature like Cilhwch and Olwen and The Four Branches are full of parallels and borrowings from Irish stories, whereas Irish storytelling doesn't seem to have been influenced by Britain, at least not very much. So why is the influence all flowing from west to east? My guess is that the continuity of British lore must have been severely affected by the Roman and Saxon invasions. The Romans intentionally tried to destroy the Druids, for example, who were known to be keepers of lore. And although I'm sure they weren't all on Anglesey that day of the slaughter of the Druids, they were pretty much forced underground and lost a lot of status. So it's easy to imagine how native Brythonic stories were at least partly forgotten. Those forgotten stories may have been quite similar to the ones the Irish had in the very early centuries AD, like when the Romans were in Britain. We can't say that for sure, of course, but it would make sense that when the Welsh were exposed to Irish medieval stories, that they had a distant, familiar ring to them, and that this might have made them particularly attractive, consciously or unconsciously. Perhaps the Welsh felt like they had found something that fit like a long lost glove, to borrow a metaphor from yesterday. Probably the best recent study of the two Brans is a paper written in 2007 by John Carey called Bran, Son of Faval and Bran, Son of Fear. Carey points out a noticeable or notable parallel between the earlier Bran story about the women in the well and the second branch. He says, one of the more memorable scenes in Branwen is that in which the British army takes ship for Ireland. Bran himself crosses the sea by wading. Some additional information provided at this point in the narrative, however, somewhat undercuts the prodigiousness of his feat, because it says, and the sea was not great then. He went by wading. There were only two rivers, Tlí and Archan they were called, and after that the sea increased when the sea took possession of the kingdoms. Nowhere else is there any suggestion that the Irish Sea of those days was any different from what it was in later ages. And at this point, Carey goes on to remind us that everyone else seems to travel in big ships in this story, which it does feel a little anomalous, doesn't it? It makes sense that Bran might wade because he's so tall, but the idea of the sea being really low is maybe a little more out of place. He goes on to say, comparison with the older Bran tale, he's talking about the first one now about going into the well. Comparison with the older Bran tale, however, suggests that these lines in Branwen need not be regarded as secondary, but can be seen as an unassimilated bit of earlier tradition, just as the submersion of Bran MacPhail's realm beneath the waters of Loch Foyle seemed to have followed upon his otherworld raid. So Bran Vabfleur's adventure precedes the disappearance of unnamed kingdoms beneath the waters of the sea. There's quite a lot of back and forth in Carrie's paper because some of you may know that there are, of course, other stories in Wales about drowned lands and so on. It's an interesting observation, and it's worth adding to the pile, I think, of things we know about these stories and things we notice about them. In fact, this paper by John Carey is full of good stuff, but unfortunately, it's not freely available online. I could walk us through Carey's paper, and I could compare the different theories about where this story originates and how it split and developed into 3 stories, all about a king called Bran who goes to the other world. Except Bran, son of Llŷr, doesn't go to the other world, not exactly. But I think there was a period when the people of Britain, Ireland was almost as mysterious as the other world. Just as the people of Ireland sometimes believed that the Isle of Man was Manannan's Isle of Apples, an otherworld paradise, perhaps Bendigeid Fran's raid on Ireland was seen as leaving the known world and going to a magical destination where rules of logic and nature don't really apply. We could go round and round with all these theories. We could go looking for an Indo-European Ur-myth by hunting down similar stories from other cultures. Sometimes I wonder why people do this so much. Of course, people wonder why I do what I do. So, I mean, good luck to them. But seriously, we have 3 fabulous stories here. And I think we can miss out on how much they are each, in their way, part of the fabulous wealth of Celtic language stories. All 3 stories, and the Mongan material, and all the stories about raids for cauldrons, they're all like gorgeous gems. And for me, at least, every single one of them holds some kind of indescribable spiritual meaning. The fact that they're deeply connected is also a wondrous mystery. And asking ourselves what the stories mean to us, how they speak to us, is at least as important as trying to reconstruct some kind of original version. These stories aren't less true because they're developments from an earlier story. I think they're refinements, they're expressions of their individual times and places. The answer I'm seeing to most of all of this is yes and, not either or. But if you want a little hint about Carey's paper, he really flirts with the conclusion that this story started in Britain and was exported to Ireland somehow, although he doesn't have very good ways to explain it. If there ever was a common Celtic version of this story, it might be interesting to know about, but we wouldn't find it by trimming off all the differences between the stories we have. And who's to say it was a better story anyway, or contained more truth? I like the kaleidoscopic approach to Celtic myth. We've got 3 stories for the price of 1 here. Surely that has to be a win. Bye-bye for this year. Hey guys, I'm back. I thought I would just talk a little bit about the classes that are coming up in the first section of the year between now and sort of Easter. The Introduction to Celtic Mythology class, that starts quite soon. It starts next Saturday, the 4th of January. So, you need to be kind of ready for that if that's what's going to happen. So there's some abbreviations and things here, but I'll talk about it as we go. So this is the Introduction to Celtic Mythology class. It starts on January the 4th. It runs all the way through April 5th. There are some weeks off in that. Oh, and I should talk about the times too. So Introduction to Celtic Mythology meets on Saturdays, noon Pacific, 3 p.m. Eastern, and 8 p.m. UK. And a lot of my classes meet at that time. Like this next one, Rashicoats. So Rashicoats is a Scottish folk tale or fairy tale, if you like, which exists in lots of different versions, and it's really fun. And I'm really looking forward to teaching this. So if you like stories and you're not that bothered about Celtic mythology and the heavy stuff, you might really like Rashi Coates. She's a fantastic, it's a sort of a version of Cinderella, but not Cinderella as we know it. So it's really a lot of fun. That's just a 4-week class. So if you're thinking of paying for classes, the fact that it's 4 weeks makes it not that expensive. Intro to Celtic Mythology is a wee bit expensive, but it's worth it. It's 12 weeks. I have to charge for that. And then at the end of January, a 6-week class, Tales of the Old North. Now this one is on Wednesdays in the evening, my time. So it's 5 o'clock Pacific, 8 o'clock Eastern, and the wee small hours in the UK. You can access recordings if you're desperate to do the class and you don't want to take a class in the wee small hours. You can take the class and watch the recordings and get the notes in your email. I'm hoping to teach this class called Taliesin Connections. It will be the first time this year. And this will really be about the poetry of Taliesin, mainly mining it for meaning, looking at the historical context to some extent. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on the Taliesin folklore, Ceridwen, the story about how Taliesin comes into being. We will touch on it, of course, but we'll mostly be digging into the poems, trying to understand the meaning in the poems and the historical context. And it's called Taliesin Connections because I want to look at how the poems connect to other Celtic mythology as well. So that's what's going on with that, but it says to be confirmed. I need to make sure I have enough people before I put the effort into run a new class. A few people have been in touch. It's currently scheduled for Wednesdays at noon Pacific, 8 p.m. UK. But if people wanted me to, if this would suit more people, I could teach it earlier on Saturdays. So then that would be like 10 a.m. Pacific, 6 p.m. UK. If you're interested in this class, I've been asking people to get in touch with me if they think they would take this class. So feel free to email me, leave me a message somewhere where you think I'll see it, and say that you're interested, and I need your email address. So it's better if you email me. You can tell when I talk about it, I'm quite excited about it. IBC is Irish Brythonic Connections. So this is quite a casual, fun class. Again, only 4 weeks. We look at Irish stories that connect to Welsh stories, that sort of thing, which everybody knows is my favorite thing in the world. So that's the plan. And that's another one that one definitely will be Wednesdays, 5 p.m. Pacific, wee small hours in the UK. And then something might go here, but that would be at the beginning of May. I haven't figured it out yet. And then the Manannán class. Now, Tales of the Old North, I didn't talk about that one. That starts at the end of the month, end of January. And that's about Irin of Reged and Owain of Reged and Peredur and Taliesin, the historical Taliesin, Myrddin. So all those kind of Henoglyph tales are in that class. And that one is pay what you can. So it's not full price. You can choose an affordable price point for you. And that is also true of Irish Brythonic Connections. That's a pay what you can class. And Manannán is a pay what you can class. So I haven't got this wide enough to see the Manannán class, but it starts in the middle of May sometime and runs through June. So the full price classes right now are these three: Introduction to Celtic Mythology, Rashi Coates, and Taliesin Connections. I'd love to see some people in Rashi Coates. I think it's going to be a lot of fun. So that's really all I have to say. I hope that made sense. If it didn't, email me a question. Say, what the heck were you talking about? So thanks for listening, and I'll see you soon. Bye-bye.